upset on the internet. Your assault's a dog.
Hi everybody, welcome to Retro Station 1989. I'm Commander Dan, the commander and lone human inhabitant of the Retro Station. We review retro games here, and this is License to Play, where we review licensed retro games. Things like games based on movies or comic books or TV shows, sometimes breakfast cereal mascots, sometimes fast food mascots. If it was retro and had a license, we review it and see if it has a license to play. Now, folks, the boys at Continue take this time every year to play and enjoy all things fantasy. Books, TV, movies, and while I evaluate retro games based on licensed properties, I too participate every year in Fantasy Month.
Didn't feel right. That didn't feel right at all. No. That was just a really strange fantasy month. Fantasy Month! That's Fantasy Month.
That is Fantasy Month. This month, we're going to evaluate games of swords, sorcery, flights of fancy, and based in total fantasy. And this week, we're going to talk about a game that blew me away as a kid and contributed to a lifelong love of the oddball games that get hate sometimes. And this is going to be the thread through most of the games this month. Today's game, let's just say the amount folks don't know about it is pretty surprising. So let's dive in and learn a thing or six. Way back in the history of the format known as video-type games, there was an ancient war brewing. On one side, the console kiddies, who were addicted to the quarter-hoovering arcade cabinets and wanted a similar experience at home, and the cutting-edge video warriors using what were called microcomputers, or personal computers, to plunge into far more complex and grown-up video gaming experiences. In the US in 1983, the world of console gaming was considered defunct. Many things contributed to this cataclysm, not the least of which were titles that overpromised to the arcade-thirsty kiddies and adults and far underdelivered to them, with titles like E.T. and moreover Pac-Man, which should have been a slam dunk for Atari, but it ended up more like just a slam. Yeah. But in the UK, they had the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64. They were still playing games, and it had never been hotter. And in Japan, both the manufacture of video games and the creation of new games electrified that sector of business. Games and their creation were beginning to surge into popularity and competence. Around this time, ASCII created a home computer called the MX, and folks, this thing was a gaming powerhouse, and the type of game that the MX excelled at were non-scrolling adventure and action games. And in 1983, the Japanese market was enthralled with this game, Ultima, a United States role-playing game, and its first three entries, The First Age of Darkness. One video game creator, Yoshio Kiya, created a series of video games called Dragon Slayer, which weren't a series per se, more like Final Fantasy, where the stories are for the most part separate, but the themes of fantasy and action and adventure were primary, and some of the themes and characters and items even would show up in each adventure game. Yoshio Kiya is probably best known for the Dragon Slayer series, but worked on legendary titles for the Famicom and Super Famicom. The first two East games, as well as the impossible-to-find but glorious Popful Mail and Brandish, which are a great pair of Super Famicom titles. Get them if you can, but don't be surprised when the price hits you in the face with a $1,000 price tag. Today's evaluation is a licensed game in the Dragon Slayer series of games. During Nintendo's boom period with the NES in the United States, we got two of the famous Dragon Slayer series. The first was Dragon Slayer 4, the Drozzle family, known in the US as Legacy of the Wizard, an early Metroidvania-style action game where you could play as the entire family of adventurers and seek out treasure and fame, and the Dragon Slayer Blade. And the second is a licensed title, because it's a side story to the game Xanadu, and is a sequel to the anime based on Xanadu. So, the oddest thing about this licensed title is that it's a video game sequel story based on the licensed anime from the first and second Xanadu's video game. You got all that? Because the title we're going to talk about was a partnership between Falcom and Hudson Soft, the creators of the Dragon Slayer series, and released as a first-party title by Nintendo of America, and it's called Faxanadu. So in 1983, all that was happening in Japan, and here in the States, we were suffering a major video game crash based partially on creators not seeing the forest for the trees, but more because the money folks only saw profit in a pastime that was burgeoning in its popularity. And and they produced what's now known as shovelware, which ought to have been more accurately called landfillerware, or bulldozerware. We were still 2 years from the NES coming to our shores, but why does this week's game get consideration as a licensed title? Let's take a look. Dragon Slayer, the series, was focused on creating an action-adventure style of gameplay, and the aesthetic of swords and sorcery and high fantasy were a hot property in Japan throughout the 80s, and the Dragon Slayer series released Xanadu in 1985, and it was a big success, influencing how fantasy action games were played and how adventure games would be made going forward. Miyamoto has mentioned Xanadu as an influence in how The Legend of Zelda's playstyle was developed. Then we get to 1987. Nintendo is pushing for fantasy RPGs by giving subscribers to Nintendo Power a copy of Dragon Warrior for free, known in Japan as the Dragon's Quest series, and set their sights on the Dragon Slayer series as an also-ran in case Dragon Warrior took off, and in Japan, Xanadu had just released an anime film called Xanadu, which the Nintendo of America release, Faxanadu, was going to be a side story of. Xanadu the cartoon, an OVA or original video animation about a 21st century soldier dropped into the world of Xanadu, where he wields the Dragon Slayer blade to protect the realm, was also a hit. This OVA has it all. There's action, blue hair, big eyes, crazy expressions, that 1980s metal, everything you need in an 80s anime epic that you shouldn't take too seriously because it's kind of cheesy. But it does give us the world that our story in our game this week takes place in. Today we're talking about a side story and spin-off to that movie, Faxanadu by Falcom and Nintendo. Or Hudson Soft if you were in Japan. Today, we're talking about a license. Bam, Xanadu. And the game we're talking about this week, Faxanadu for the NES. For Fantasy Month.
Fantasy I don't know why I slapped myself on the face. That's Fantasy
My
Month.
face is all red.
That is Fantasy Month. Thanks, Cambot Jr. I have a lot of sentimental ties to this game. But let's take a look at the game's production first of all. This game is like a mystery, but the mystery isn't really all that mysterious. Let's plunge into the mists of the past to better help us evaluate whether or not Faxanadu has a license to play. Hudson Soft and Falcom teamed up with Nintendo to put out Dragon Slayer's third game, Faxanadu, after the success of Dragon Slayer's second game's OVA, and went with a post-apocalyptic version of that world. Nintendo Power did a feature preview article on the game and also a full review and gameplay strategy breakdown in the 6th and 7th issues of the Nintendo Power magazine, and then released Faxanadu, and that's what I'm going to call it because that's what everyone calls it, is not Faxanadu, but Faxanadu as a first-party game. The development period was about a year and a half. They'd already had a structure for how these games were made, and the game met with gangbuster business in Japan, where all the Dragon Slayer series had been going on since the 80s, and all the way darn near to today. As a matter of fact, I believe one of the games came out in 2008. Folks, this game was one of my earliest victories over a game that is legit Nintendo hard, and one of my proudest. The strategy guides were available, but I didn't have those issues of Nintendo Power. But I did keep an eye out for any kind of secrets or any kind of tips that will help you, and I'll give you one right now. In the first town that you come to, that's Aeolus, your character arrives, you're penniless, and are told by the first guy in town before you see the monsters, who you have to jump over. Don't try fighting them because you don't have a weapon. Go see the king. Well, then you go see the king, and he gives you 1,500 gold. The trick is, when you come to him penniless, he gives you 1,500 gold from his coffers. Spend all that money, go back to him, fully laden with gear and training. Guess what? He'll give you another $1,500. Do this until you have at least 10 of each key, you have all of the weapons and all of the armor, and you're ready for adventure, folks. And that's my one hint for the game. The rest of it, grind it out. Listen to the people in the towns because they offer some good advice, and sometimes they offer you nothing. But you can beat this game, trust me. And I don't know if I mentioned it before, but 1989, that's a pretty significant year to old Commander Dan and the Retro Station. In 1989, I was 14 and my folks split. Yeah, so that sucked. My dad and my grandmother did their best to make it as non-traumatic as it might have been for my brother and I, and part of that was getting us a Nintendo. And my dad started liking RPGs with Dragon Warrior. We both kind of dug into that one and we played it all the way through and we beat it. And he liked Zelda 2 better because, and the game we're reviewing today, because he was also an arcade guy. He made me an arcade guy, a video game guy. So we both played this game. side by side, taking turns as the weekends grew into the middle of spring and then early summer. Bang. Every night was basically hammering our heads against this game until we finally plowed through it and beat it. It took us like 2 months, but in the summer of 1989, we beat this game, and I tell you what, beating the Dark Lord of this game is so, or the Evil One as they call him in the book, is so good. So good. So, let's get started and review Faxanadu. The fact that it's a side story of an anime gets its foot in the door for consideration for a license to play, but we've got to judge this thing on its merits and its flaws. Little shout out to my vampire playing friends out there. Now let's take a closer look. Daggers and wing boots, mantras and monsters await you. This is the cover art for the American release of Faxanadu. In Japan, the cover looked like this. Now notice the artistic flourishes here and how it looks just like the successful OVA from a couple years before. In fact, that is the fella from that movie. I think his name is Fiolis, I think. I can't remember what the guy's name is. Now, the game is a side story. It takes place in the future of the world that was saved in the OVA and how it all goes to hell. You play a wandering hero, a nameless elf who returns home to find it a blistered wasteland. Aeolus, the city that he's from, is a dusty, withered heath because meteors have been striking the World Tree, the home of the elves, established in the other Dragon Slayer games and the OVA, if I remember correctly. And the dwarves from the mountain, the tree that grows right near it is this huge mountain, they've all mutated into chthonic, Lovecraftian monsters. And folks, that's where it starts. The manual uses art from one of my favorite Nintendo Power artists, Shuji Imai, the original Howard and Nestor artist, and the one who did the fantastic Final Fantasy art in the Nintendo Power Special, and some of my favorite pieces in the Dragon Warrior Strategy Guide insert. He did monster pics, and he also did pics of the spells. And he's often confused with Katsuya Terada, who had a similar style, but was more loose, kind of a more manga-esque style. But Shuji Imai had more of a cartoonist or illustrator style that I've used part of his style in my own style as a professional illustrator. The manual sets the tone with the map of the World Tree in the Land of Darkness. Check this out. Basically, the Land of Darkness is the center, actually, of the monolithic range of cliffs and mountains next to the World Tree, and show you that you're going to be trekking through some rough, fantasy-ass terrain. The game is a side-scrolling adventure RPG, like Simon's Quest or Zelda, only it does everything right. Your hero is tasked with ascending the World Tree and penetrating the dark caverns of the formerly stout but kind dwarven folk to confront the Evil One in the dark fortress of Zenith, and use the Dragon Slayer blade and the battlesuit of armor to destroy the villain once and for all and bring peace and restore water back to the elvish village. And if you take a look at all of the gear and what you look like when you have it all, it looks pretty damn familiar, I think. Yeah, that's right. All of the gear, the Dragon Slayer blade, it's all from Xanadu, the cartoon. Anyway, each town has a keymaker, townsfolk's places like a saloon and homes, who have some helpful and some straight useless but flavorful bits of trivia, and a guru who'll give you your mantra. Holy shit. This mantra is your password, right, for the game. And it looks like someone sneezed out BBs onto a keyboard and recorded whatever ended up on the screen. It's frickin' heinous. But the game is worth it, folks. There's other shops. There's the trainers and the hardware store where you can get weapons and armor and potions and such. There's also the food store where you can purchase food to get a quick heal up. But there's also places where you can get that done. So just basically, if you kill monsters, occasionally they drop loaves of bread and such. So kind of mind your money there, because you really don't, after the first town, you don't get that wonderful bonus of coming to the king with your hat in your hand. At any rate, all of it comes together to let you know that you're going to be buying your way to victory through this game. From Forepaw to Zenith. So get ready to fight the monsters and grind a bit, you filthy novice. No, that's not an insult. That's what you're called at first level. See, as you raise through the ranks, you go from aspirant to veteran to hero to lord. They have all sorts of great medieval adjectives for each level of the game. They even call you a Myrmidian. One of those guys who was on Jason the Argonaut's boat. You get to be a lord at the end. No, not Lord of the Sword. Shit, no one wants to be Lord of the Sword. Not even Lord of the Sword. Look at his face. But you battle through the game, trying to restore fresh water to your home in a far-flung future fantasy setting. You get magic, weapons, and find yourself battling some messed up looking monsters, muffed up looking bosses that are actually impressive for this era where Nintendo was hitting on all cylinders. And with Nintendo and Falcom and Hudson Soft teaming up to give you an action-adventure game, folks, I don't often use this term because it's reserved for titles I think are overlooked and promise to serve up a feast for your fun senses. And so, Faxanadu is officially a hidden sandwich.
Hidden sandwich certified.
So there's one question left. Does Faxanadu for the NES by Hudson Soft and Nintendo have a license to play? Heck yeah! I mean, from its graphics and sound and gameplay to its carefully paced advancement and action-based grinding, this game has everything you're looking for in what I like to call a hidden sandwich. And that's going to do it for this evaluation. Send that one on, Margot. But folks, this month continues next week with another fantasy game that some of you may have played, and many of you may have not, but it's got a lot to live up to for Fantasy Month.
Fantasy
That is Fantasy Month. And remember, no matter what I've said before, or will ever say again, or will say next week here on the Retro Station's License to Play, remember to always, always stay retro. Peace.
Get upset on the internet. You're a salt adult. You're a salt adult. Get upset on the internet. You're a salt adult. Throwing out a hissy fit, your views ain't in the millions, and every up and comer is a threat to what you're dealing. And instead of getting better, you just pout up on your Facebook, crying on your Twitter bit about how bad your case look. In case you didn't get it yet, allow me to rephrase it. You're cry more than my 4-year-old. I'm actually amazed, like you couldn't even see the forest for the trees.